Hi, bookworm buddies. Welcome back to the final two chapters of the Boxcar Children. Woo. Chapter 12, James Henry and Henry James. Dr. Moore went to get his mother. Mother, he said, this is Mr. James Henry Alden. He wants to take his grandchildren to live with him. I'm afraid they won't want to go with you, said Mrs. Moore, until they've learned to like you, and they won't want to go while Violet is so sick. Can't I see them? Begged Mr. Alden. I won't tell them who I am. That would help, agreed the doctor. If they grow to like you before they know who you are, things will be easier. Yes, said Mrs. Moore, stay here with us for a while. The children will learn to like you, and then we can tell them that you are their grandfather. Thank you, said Mr. Alden. I will go home and get some clothes and come back, and I will give you the $5,000. But Dr. Moore would not take the money. I just want these children to be happy, he said. When Mary learned that she was to cook for Mr. Alden, she was frightened. How can I cook for him, she cried. He has everything. He's a very rich man. You can cook for anyone, said Dr. Moore kindly. Just go get your good chicken dinners and make some cherry dumplings. At dinner, Mr. Alden saw all his grandchildren but Violet. He smiled with delight when he saw Jessie come into the room in her quiet way. Children, said Mrs. Moore, this is Mr. Henry. Benny laughed. Henry and Mr. Henry, he remarked. Now that's funny. Where have I seen that man before, thought Henry. The children liked to hear Mr. Henry talk. He told them about a big cucumber in his garden. The cucumber is growing inside of a bottle and he couldn't get it out. Why not? Said Benny. It's too big, said Mr. Alden. How did it get in there? Asked Benny. It was a little cucumber when it went in, said Mr. Alden. The cucumber will grow just the same in the bottle. It will grow so big you can't get it out. I'd like to see that cucumber, said Benny, stopping in the middle of his cherry dumpling. Would you really? Said Mr. Alden, delighted. Someday you and I will go over and pick it, and we can bring it to Violet, said Benny. Yes, we'll bring it to Violet, agreed Mr. Alden. Henry thought again. Where have I seen this man before? I wish I could remember. He couldn't remember, but he liked Mr. Alden very much. All the children liked him because he was kind to them. At last one day, Mr. Alden could see Violet and went softly into her room with some beautiful flowers from his garden. The children loved him as he patted Violet's dark head and told her he was sorry she'd been sick. He told her, too, about his garden where the flowers came from. I'd like to see your garden, said Violet. I love flowers. How long are you going to stay, Mr. Henry? Said Benny. Shh, Benny, said Jessie. I want to stay here as long as I can, my boy, said Mr. Alden quietly. Henry looked at the man again. He knew that he had heard him say my boy before. Now, where was it? He couldn't remember. After dinner, Mr. Alden sat under a tree reading. Henry was working in the flower garden in front of the house. He looked at Mr. Alden again and again. Suddenly, it came to him as the man smiled over his book. That's the same man who gave me the $25 prize and the silver cup, he said to himself. I didn't remember him at first because I was so excited when he shook my hand. He took another look and said, That's the very same man. Henry sat thinking for a little while. Then he got up to find Dr. Moore. Did you know who gave me the prize on field day? He said to the doctor. Do you know what his name was? James Alden of the mill, replied the doctor. J.H. Alden over in Greenfield. He didn't look at Henry while he was saying it. Poor Henry was so surprised he almost fell over. That kind man was his grandfather. He went out and sat on the steps to think about it. To begin with, the man was too young. Henry had thought his grandfather would be an old man with white hair. Mrs. Moore called to him, Mr. Henry. Could it be that the man who they knew as their grandfather, and he knew they were their grandfather, and didn't tell them? Then he saw that Mr. Alden was getting out of his chair under the trees. It's now or never, thought Henry. I have to know. He walked eagerly after the man who was going towards the garden with his back to Henry. Then the man turned around and saw how excited Henry was. Are you James Henry Alden of Greenfield? Said Henry. I am, my boy, replied Mr. Alden with a smile. Does this mean you know that I know you are Henry James Alden? Yes, said Henry quietly. Then James Henry Alden shook hands again with Henry James Alden. Jessie and Benny came around the grass just in time to hear Henry say, But grandfather. Grandfather? Cried Jessie. What do you mean, Henry? Yes, Jessie, said Henry. This man we have been running away from all this time. This man right here is our grandfather. I thought you were old, said Benny, and cross. Jessie said so. I didn't know, Benny, said Jessie. Her face was red. To think of running away from this kind man. But her grandfather didn't seem to mind. He patted her on the head and said, Let's go up and see Violet. There was no stopping Benny. He hurried up to Violet's room, holding Mr. Alden by the hand and shouting, "It's Grandfather, Violet." "Excuse me?" "And he isn't cross after all." "What do you mean?" Violet said. "Isn't he Mr. Henry?" "My name is James Henry Alden," replied the grandfather. "And my name is Henry James Alden," cried Henry. "Well, well," said Dr. Moore. Violet held onto her grandfather's hand and listened to the rest of them talk excitedly. "Where have you been living?" said Mr. Alden at last. They all looked at each other, even Dr. Moore and his mother. Then they laughed as if they would never stop. "You ought to see," said Dr. Moore. "What?" cried all the children at once. "You never saw it in the daytime." "Is that so?" laughed the doctor. "I've seen it many times in the daytime." "Seen what?" said Mr. Alden. "Our house," said Jessie. "We've been living in a boxcar in the woods." Then they all began to tell him about the dump and the dishes and the brook and the swimming pool. "We have 4 beds of pine needles in the car." "How do you know that?" said Jessie. "Well," said Dr. Moore, "the first day Henry worked for me, I walked after him as far as the hill." "Why did you do that?" said Mr. Alden. "I liked him. I saw he was a fine boy, and I wanted to see where he lived." "But you didn't see the boxcar from the hill," said Jessie. "No, but I came back at night and looked around," said Dr. Moore. "About 10 o'clock?" said Jessie. "Yes," said the doctor. "I stepped on a stick and you heard me." "Our rabbit!" cried Jessie and Henry together. "Watch barked." "Yes, I heard the dog bark, so I knew you were in the boxcar, and then I went home." "But you came back," said Jessie. "Oh, yes, when you were picking cherries, I went up to see your house. I wanted to see if you had enough to eat and enough dishes." "Why didn't you tell me?" said Mr. Alden. "Didn't you know they were my grandchildren?" The doctor laughed. "Yes, I did, but they were having a fine time, and then I didn't want to tell you. They got along very well until Violet got sick. Then I told you." "I'm very glad you did," said Mr. Alden. "I have seen your house, too," said Mrs. Moore. "I went up one day and saw all your dishes. I like your big pitcher and teapot." "All of you have seen it but me," said Mr. Alden. "We'll show you," cried Benny. "I'll show you my cart made out of wheels and my pink cup." "Good for you, Benny," said Grandfather, much pleased. "When Violet gets well, we'll all go up. And if you will show me your house, I will show you my house." "Do you have a house?" asked Benny in surprise. "Yes, you can live there with me if you like. I've been looking for you children for a long time." Violet was soon well enough, and one afternoon they all started out to see the boxcar. The doctor took them in his car. Many people looked out the window to watch Mr. Alden and his grandchildren. They were glad the children had found such a kind grandfather at last. When they arrived at their old house, they ran up, all talking excitedly. Watch sniffed and sniffed around, looking for the bone he buried. Everything was the same. "Here's the dam for the pool," Henry said to his grandfather. "See our building?" shouted Benny, for that's what he called the fireplace. "It really burns, too, and there's a refrigerator in the waterfall, and here's my pink cup." They all stepped on the stoop and climbed into the car. They looked at the 4 beds and the dishes. "Here's the same old pitcher and teapot," said Jessie, laughing. They found the blue tablecloth, and they all sat down by the brook and ate chicken and bread and butter and cookies. Benny drank milk from his pink cup. "Come, we ought to go now," said Dr. Moore at last. "The sun's going down. I don't want Violet to take any more cold." They closed the boxcar and said goodbye, but they were all sorry to go. "Tomorrow," Mr. Alden said, "will you come to see my house?" "Oh, yes," said the children happily. They didn't know what a beautiful house it was or what good times they were going to have in it. Chapter 13, A New Home for the Boxcar. The children's grandfather wanted them to like his house. He wanted them to live with him all the time, so he made over some of the rooms just for them. The children went with him in his car to see the house. The car stopped in front, and Henry cried in surprise, "You mean you live here in this beautiful house?" It was a beautiful house. It was very big, with many trees and flower gardens around it. "You may live here, too, if you like my house," remarked the grandfather, watching Henry's face. The house was beautiful inside, too. There were flowers everywhere. There were maids everywhere. The children went up to the bedrooms. "Oh," cried Jessie, "this is Violet's room." It really was Violet's room. There were violets on the wallpaper. The bed was white with a violet cover. On the table were flowers. "What a beautiful room," cried Violet, sitting down in a soft, pretty chair. All the children shouted when they saw Benny's room. The wallpaper was blue and covered in big rabbits and dogs and bears. There was a rocking horse and a toolbox and little tables and chairs, and an engine stood on a track of cars that was almost as big as the little boy himself. Benny ran over to the engine. "Can I run this train all day?" he asked. He sat down on the floor by the engine. "Oh, no," said Henry. "You're going to go to school as soon as it begins." His grandfather laughed. "That's right, my boy. You'll like school. You'll learn to read." "Oh, I can read now," said Benny. In Jessie's room, they found a bed for Watch. It was on the floor by her bed. Watch got in at once, sniffed at the pillow, turned around 3 times, and laid down. He likes it, said Jessie. He'll sleep by me. Just then the children heard a doorbell ring. A maid came to find Mr. Alden. A man to see you, she said. About the dog? Now when Jessie heard the word dog, she was frightened. She was afraid it was about Watch. They won't take Watch away, she whispered to Henry. No, indeed, we'll never, ever give him up. Henry, Jessie, and the other children went down with their grandfather to see the man, and Jessie was more frightened than ever. Watch didn't growl at the man. He jumped up at him delightedly. You see, he was my dog, said the man, but I sold him to a lady, and he ran away from her the very day. I have to turn him over to the lady I sold him to. How do you know he's the same dog? Said Mr. Alden. Oh, he's my dog, said the man. You see how he knows me, and he has a small spot on his foot. But someone has cut his hair on one side. Benny looked. They found the black spot on Watch's foot. I never saw that spot before, said Henry. I will give you whatever you want for the dog, said Mr. Alden. The children love him. They want to keep him. But I sold him to the lady, said the man. I must take the dog to her. Then Henry said, maybe she will want to change to another dog when she sees his hair. If she will agree to take another dog, will you let my grandfather have this one? Yes, I will, said the man. Let's go and ask her, grandfather, said Benny. We'll let Jessie have Watch. She'll let Jessie have Watch. He's her dog. She took the thorn out of his foot. The man told Mr. Alden where the lady lived, and they all started out to find her. She was a pretty young lady, and she asked them to sit down. But Benny couldn't wait. He said, please let us keep Watch. I want him, and Jessie wants him, and we didn't want him, and we don't know he's your dog. What do you mean, said the lady. Who's Watch? The dog is Watch, said Henry. The man came to our grandfather's house today and told us he sold the dog to you. And when Watch ran away from you, the day you bought him, he came to us. He had a thorn in his foot, and Jessie took it out. Watch looked up at the lady and wagged his tail. When she looked at him, she began to laugh. Look at his side, she said. Who cut his hair? I'm sorry, said Henry. Benny did one day with Violet's scissors. I'm not sorry, said the lady. He looks so funny. You want to keep him? Is that it? Oh, yes, said Jessie. The man will let us have him if you'll take another dog. Don't be afraid, said the young lady. You may keep your dog. I can change to another one. Oh, thank you. You're so nice, said Benny. He ran to the lady and climbed up in her lap before anyone could stop him. I'd like to keep you, Benny, in place of the dog, laughed the lady, putting her arms around him. How happy the children were to have Watch to keep. Mr. Alden gave the money to the man at once. 4 happy children sat with their grandfather around the Alden dining room table that night. The maid smiled in the kitchen to hear the children laugh, and the children laughed because Watch had a chair at the table beside Jessie and really waited on by a maid. Would you ever think that 4 children could be homesick for such a beautiful home? Jessie was the first one to wish for the old boxcar. One day she said, oh, grandfather, I'd like to cook something one day more in the dear old kettle in the woods. Get out in the kitchen, my dear, said her grandfather. The maids will help you. You can cook whatever you want. Jessie liked it, but it wasn't like the old days in the boxcar. Then one day Benny said, Grandfather, I wish I could drink my milk out of my dear old pink cup. Grandfather began to think. He had some pink cups, but they were not so dear to Benny as his cracked old one. At last Mr. Alden said, I'm going to give you children a surprise. Is it very nice? Said Benny. No, not very, laughed his grandfather. It isn't pretty at all. When will it come? Said Benny. It will come today. You children must all go over to Dr. Moore's and stay until the surprise comes. What could it be? Wondered Violet. Her grandfather laughed. I hope you will like it, he said. It is very heavy. The children were glad to see sweet Mrs. Moore and the kind doctor again. They stayed until Mr. Alden said the surprise was ready. Then Dr. Moore and his mother went back with them in the big car. Mr. Alden was as happy as a boy. He took them out by the garage and through the big garden. At last, they came to a garden with a fountain in the middle and trees around it. Next to the fountain, there was a surprise. It was the old boxcar. The children ran over to it with cries of delight and opened the door and climbed inside. Everything was there in place. Even the old dead stump was there to step on. Here was the old knife that had cut butter and bread and vegetables and firewood and string. Here is Benny's pink cup, and there is his bed. Here's the big kettle and the blue tablecloth. Here were the pitcher and the old teapot. And here was the dinner bell, which the children had made from an old tin can. Benny hung it on the tree with a string and rang it over and over again with a spoon. Watch rolled on the floor of the car and barked, and then he began to sniff everything. He's looking for the bone he buried, laughed Benny. How they love the old boxcar, said Mrs. Moore. I'd like to see them so happy. Thank you for the surprise, Grandfather, said Violet. We'll never go away from you again. I hope not, my dear, said Mr. Alden. We'll all live happily ever after. And they did. The end. I hope you enjoyed the Boxcar, children, and I will see you again soon with the next installment of Bookworm Buddies.